I was lying in bed last night, alone and forlorn, wondering to myself what single, memorable, powerful message could I leave with you today to improve your capacity to understand the subject of my presentation. But having now unfortunately listened to the very muted tones of your greeting, I've suddenly decided that what I really want to do today is to leave with you an improved capacity to applaud. Ladies and gentlemen, could I introduce myself again? Brian Hurd. Hey, there is life in the East Leagues Club. Have you noticed how life is full of creeps? Out there in Creepland, there are things like bracket creep. Have you heard of bracket creep? The longer you work, madam, the higher your income goes, the higher your tax brackets go. It's called bracket creep. And there's what's called frailty creep. Have you heard of frailty creep? Have you noticed how we go through life at 4 miles per hour, 3 miles per hour, 2 miles per hour, 1 mile per hour, stop. You notice that? And there's another one. It's called decoupling creep. Decoupling creep. Yes, madam, you'll hear some very interesting things today. Decoupling creep. You were 18, remember, maybe even younger. You met your first boyfriend or girlfriend. How did you show in those days your undying lust, devotion, and dedication? You used to walk down the street waist embracing. You remember that? Waist embracing. But that became a little bit difficult after a while. He wasn't a very good dancer, no rhythm. So you had to resort to hand-holding. Remember that? Hand-holding, hand-holding. Then you got married. And you ended up doing what's called parallel ambulation. Remember that? Walking down the street, you're here, he's over there, and the distance between you is proportional to the number of children you have. And then you retire, and you become what's called the Royals. You know the Royals? She's up there, and he's about 10 metres behind. They're a couple, but they're vertically separated, not horizontally anymore, vertically. And then you get very mature, and you become suddenly solo. Suddenly solo. And you enter what I call the mosh pit of families. The family becomes suddenly more relevant, doesn't it? Have you noticed that? Suddenly more relevant. Today, I want to talk to you about retirement and relationships. And I want to talk to you about 4 things in retirement and relationships. Being re-single, remarry, re-partner, and re-family. Does that sound exciting? Yes. Re-single. Single again, remember that? You're single again. Why do you suddenly become single again? The 3 Ds. Divorce, death, and dementia. Divorce. You'll be surprised to hear that the increase in divorce is mostly amongst older people. Gone are the days when 57-year-old marriages just potter along, they tolerate each other, the cardigan and cameo set. I often say to older clients, I say, now, what happens if he dies and you suffer from what's called the Ken and Barbie Syndrome? In other words, you meet a Ken, change your will, and give everything to the Ken. And they say, who would want him? Who would ever want him, or who would ever want her? They just tolerate each other. And then there's death. The big D word. Death is a form of divorce. Did you know that? It is. It's an involuntary divorce. And death happens. You know that, don't you? It does. 3 things about death you can say. 1, you never know when it's going to happen. 2, it will happen. And 3, having happened, it will never happen again. And then there's the D of dementia. Now, why do I include dementia in re-singling? Think about it. What happens when you contract dementia? You become somebody else, don't you? That person you've been married to for 57 years becomes somebody else. They don't know you anymore. You are effectively separated. And you can be physically separated, such as you can no longer look after him or her, and they have to move into an aged care facility. There's this fantastic story about a former Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States of America called Sandra Day O'Connor. Her husband suffered from dementia for 14 years and he was in an aged care facility. And he took up with another elderly lady in that aged care facility. It was undying love and devotion. 2 dementing people in the aged care facility. The staff agonised about whether to tell her, "Oh, excuse me, Sandra, your husband's having an affair." And one day they couldn't help themselves and they said, "Sandra, we have to tell you something. Your husband is having an affair." And they could not believe her response. She said, "That is fantastic. He's happy at last." Isn't that incredible? There they were, still married. They'd been married for 40 years. He was in an aged care facility, taken up with another love, and she was happy and he was happy. Singlehood, second time round. You know what the most common type of single older woman problem we have in our law practice? The internet. The internet. We have just finished trying to recover $230,000 from an 84-year-old lady who fell in love with the internet and thereby fell in love with a so-called retired criminal lawyer from the USA. She managed to be so smitten with this virtual relationship that she transmitted $230,000 to a bank account in the expectation that she would find love at the age of 84. She found a lawyer instead. Not such a bad result. What are you talking about? The scourge of singlehood in later life is loneliness. Loneliness is a disease. I say it's a disease. Doctors don't agree with me, but I say it is. And what people do when they're lonely can be very bad for them. Second one is remarry. Why would you do it again? Huh? I have this woman at the moment who's just finished her 4th divorce at the age of 82, from which she received $8 million in cash. She made some very prudent investments in her life. Her 4th marriage was one of them. She has this attitude to life that she wants to die single and she wants to die with nothing. She's called a skinhead. SKIN is an acronym, madam, for Spend Kids' Inheritance Now. She's a latter-day skinhead. She's been everywhere trying to spend this money. Alaska, Danube, South America, and she keeps coming back to see me and says, "Brian, I just can't spend it. I just can't find things to spend it on." I said, "Madam, you keep coming back to see me and I will help you spend it." Latter-day love. There's nothing wrong with latter-day love. I hope I'm in love when I'm 85. Don't you? It's a nice feeling, isn't it? And guess what? Being old doesn't mean you don't have feelings. It's what you do with those feelings that the lawyer gets interested in. Because when you think about it, you become a blended family, the mixed master, second time, third time, fourth time, whatever, around. What legal implications are there in becoming a blended? Interesting, isn't it? You've got children from both marriages. What do you do with your finances? Should you have a family law financial agreement? And what about wills? Huh? Who are you going to give all that wealth you've accumulated over your life? The second spouse or the children from the first marriage? How do you do that? How do you avoid a dispute? And what do you do with your money when you're still married? Here's a classic example. Rich man, he's 82, marries, poor lady, she's 75. She contracts dementia, has to go into aged care. They've agreed from the inception of their marriage to keep their finances separate. She goes into aged care and they say, we want you to pay a $400,000 RAD, it's called a refundable accommodation deposit. Used to be called an accommodation bond. She doesn't have $400,000. But being the loving husband, he says, I'll pay that $400,000. And he starts to pay it off. Pay it off. And then he comes to see me. And lawyers are very good at giving bad news. That's why lawyers have a high suicide rate. We live in this bad news environment. Very few people come to me and say, Brian, can I tell you my happy problem? So you can make me sad. He comes to me and I said, Bob. His name was Bob. Do you realise a salient legal fact? No. He said, what have I done? I said, you've just given $400,000 to your wife's children. Why? Because the law says, Bob, when your wife dies or leaves that facility, that $400,000 must be repaid to her estate. Not to you, the payer, but to her estate. Consequence, she's made a will giving everything to her, loving children. He's just given away $400,000 to people he had no intention of doing so whatsoever. But it's love, see? It's love. You do that for love, don't you? You give your money to your stepchildren. That's all a part of being in love, isn't it? You see, love's a wonderful thing. That'd make a great song, isn't it? Or is it a splendid thing? It's a splendid thing, isn't it? Starry-eyed, even later, slightly dulled stars, but still stars that are sparkling. And we'll do anything for love. But when the children start circling the wagon and they start seeing what you've done for love, you get a bit of tension. Because the third re is the re-partnering. What older people are now doing, interestingly, is partnering with people. Not in a de facto sense, but in a companion sense. Instead of going into an aged care facility, what they want to do is stay at home. So there's old people who want to stay at home, not go into aged care. The family won't help, but they know all these other older people want to stay at home as well. So what do? They move in with each other as companions. We call them, not de factos, but compactos. It's true, madam. Trust me, I'm a lawyer. It's true. Compactos. They live with each other, not in any sexual relationship sense, but simply to support and care for each other, without realising the legal implications. See, here's the lawyer again, bad news arising. Because there are two legal implications. One, by that person moving in with that person, they may be totally unrelated, just friends. They then created a legal right in both of them to challenge each other's estate And secondly, to challenge any superannuation death benefit. Isn't that incredible? Just by moving in and supporting each other, because they then become what's called dependent on each other, or interdependent. Love, it's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing. It can be a lawyer's picnic, thank God. Finally, refamilying. Have you heard of refamilying? You're mature-aged, single, and becoming a little bit frail. You need help, don't you? You do. I'm going to need help. Because I thought I was going to die abseiling, but I'm not. I'm going to actually be dying and then die, and it'll be a process, won't it? For most of us, it will. Dying comes before death. Doesn't it? Dying is a process. And as a process, you become dependent on other people to help you. You do. Trust me, it happens because we're living longer. So who's going to pick up the cudgels of your care when you need it? Because you don't want to go to an aged care facility, do you? The so-called home-like environment of an aged care facility. You want to stay in a familiar and familial environment. So what does that mean? Because of this avalanche, this wave, this boom of older people, family are now providing care. What does that mean? You or me will have to move in with the family. Trust, it's happening. It's happening. Do you want to pay $400,000 for a RAD to go into aged care? Of course you don't. But if you need care, what are you going to do? And the family have a financial investment in moving in with you. Why? Because it preserves the castle, the family home. So there's a financial investment in the future for them as much as anyone else. So we now as lawyers do what's called family agreements. Agreements between members of the family for the care of mum or dad. We've just finished one. 84-year-old self-funded retiree living in a high-rise unit at West End, having difficulties with everyday living activities. One of her 4 children says, "Mum, why don't you sell the unit and use the money to build an extension to my lovely home at Bullenvale?" SUV territory, where you can move in and I will look after you for the rest of your life. Other 3 children, very suspicious, very suspicious. They could see part of their inheritance being consumed by their loving sister to bolster the value of her lovely, lovely rambling mansion at Bullenvale. But none of them, including her, wanted to grace the halls of an aged care facility. So what are they going to do? What are they going to do? We had 2 meetings with the entire family, the 4 children and mum, and we nutted out a written family agreement, which says this: Mum will sell her unit. She will use part of the proceeds to build an extension of the daughter's home at Bullenvale, in exchange for which the daughter promises to care for her for the rest of her life. But the money she spends to build the extension is a loan, a debt owed by the daughter to mum, repayable on demand or if she has to leave. But here's the rub, listen to this. That debt will be amortised or reduced over time in deference to the care being provided by the daughter to mum. It's repayable and reducing in deference to the care being provided. Because this daughter had to give up her job to do this. She has her own children to look after. This is what this family decided should happen. And it keeps her out of aged care and within the bosom of her family, where we all want to be, don't we? Anyone here in a dysfunctional family? Isn't it incredible? Apparently 50% of families are dysfunctional, but you never see one person put their hand up when I ask that question. And we covered the what-ifs of this relationship. What if the daughter's husband goes bankrupt and the house has to be sold? What if the daughter's marriage breaks down and the house has to be sold? What if the relationship between mum and the daughter breaks down and the house has to be sold? We covered all that in this agreement. So this family now has an open, transparent agenda for their future unsullied by suspicion. I've talked to my parents with my 4 siblings about this very thing. And we've got a family agreement. Would you believe it? A lawyer doing what he's preaching. Unbelievable. How many lawyers you ask the question, you got a will? A what? Finally, I know you've got withdrawal for caffeine. I can see it in your eyes, the twitch, not to mention scones. Can I talk to you about one last aspect of relationships in later life, and that is when you lose your marbles. Can you have relationships when you've lost your marbles? You can, can't you? Like Sandra Day O'Connor's husband. He's having a relationship with someone in an aged care facility, even though he is in an advanced state of dementia. So if you lose your capacity to make your own decisions, can you still have a relationship? And what can other people do about that? Here's the interesting scenarios. Out there in Creepland, there is a creeping amount of what's called enduring powers of attorney. Have you heard of them? Bet you've all got one too, haven't you? Very good, class. Very good. Out there in enduring power of attorney land, attorneys are doing something very interesting things, such as applying to the Family Court of Australia on behalf of their incapable parent for their divorce. Now think about that. What does that mean? That means mum, who's married to dad, she's appointed one of her daughters as her enduring power of attorney. Mum has lost her capacity. The daughter applies to the Family Court of Australia for mum to divorce dad. Now, you'd be astonished, wouldn't you, if the Family Court said yes to that, wouldn't you? You would, wouldn't you? In fact, you'd have a sense of outrage, wouldn't you? But guess what? They do. Here's the example. Second marriage. There it is again. Music's in my ears. Second marriage. Man, in hospital, terminal condition, he's dying. Could be any day. Second marriage. Hasn't made a will. Consequence, the law says if he dies, half his estate goes to his loving second wife. Daughter from first marriage, apoplectic about that prospect. She can't stand her stepmother. Goes to the lawyer and says, what can I do? He's dying. If he dies, she'll get half the estate. She's a trollop. And he says, madam, what we should do is apply to the Family Court of Australia for your father to divorce your stepmother. He's off with the pixies in hospital. She applies to the Family Court of Australia for a divorce on behalf of her father, who knows nothing about what's going on. And the Family Court does 2 interesting things. Not 1, 2. Normally when you apply for a divorce, you get what's called a decree nisi, which means you get a semi-divorce decree, and then it becomes what's called absolute 28 days later. This family court said, we'll give you, daughter, the decree nisi and the decree absolute at the same time. So you'll walk out of this court with your father divorced, which they duly did. 6 hours later, guess what happened? He died. But he died in accordance with what the daughter wanted. He's single man. A single man. The consequence was all his estate went to his loving children and not to the despised stepmother. Enduring powers of attorney are also applying to the family court for property settlements between incapable spouses. So the attorneys are coming along and acting as if they are the spouses and seeking the court to re-engineer their mum or dad's finances in anticipation of their death or because of the consequences of their incapacity. That's what's happening out there in lawland. Hopefully it won't touch you, but that's what's happening out there. And that's part of my job, is to tell you what's happening out there. I'm a town crier. Now hear this. Now hear this. Ladies and gentlemen, I've run out of time. Can I recommend to you that in a spirit and a theme of positive ageing, that you should do what Joan Rivers suggested you do. Remember Joan Rivers, that acidic American comedian who died last year or the year before, somewhat tragically, when she wrote a book called Don't Count the Candles, Just Keep the Fire Lit. If you rest, you rust. It is better to expire than retire. Don't let your earning capacity get in the way of your yearning capacity. And make friends with your mirror. Ladies and gentlemen, please age positively. Stay in love, look for love, but look for your lawyer at the same time. May you live a long and happy life, and goodbye.
Do you want to take a couple of questions, Brian? Yeah. I normally take some notes and I come back with some smart remarks or anything like that, but I can't follow that act after that. So there's only one thing that sticks in my mind, and that was the classic line that Brian talked about. And love, or love, as he said, is a lawyer's picnic. How apt is that? I do thank you, Brian, as well, for picking up the pace a little bit. We do have a couple of minutes if you wish to ask any questions of Brian. Anyone? Yes? Gentleman over here in the blue shirt.
Brian, you often speak about the wills and that in your presentations, and it always gives a positive idea that once a will is made, everything's sort of in a way is set in concrete. But we read in the paper, or various people on television, they dispute the will accordingly. A situation of the man in hospital and the second wife, or various situations. How successful generally are the second spouses or family, when we do hear about the disputes, getting the decision overridden with the judges?
A will is your wish, that sounds very good, but the law allows people to challenge it. It's the law that creates this issue, not because someone is a nasty or vindictive person. The law allows a dependent, a spouse or a child, nobody else, unless you fall into those categories, allows them to challenge a will. The rate of success is increasing because the rate of challenge is increasing. In other words, there are more challenges to will year after year because of the complexity of our lives, the wealth we leave, which is a great incentive to challenge. The difficulty is we don't know the success rate so much, because while we can tell you that the success rate of people like second spouses is about 50% in court hearings, most of the challenges settle. In other words, they don't go to a hearing, the parties simply agree to resolve it. Those agreement terms are never made public. And most challenges are settled, which means we just don't know what the result of that challenge was because it's a private settlement. But you can say this, that there will be an increasing number of challenges as life goes on, as the years goes on, simply because there is an incentive to challenge, and in many cases, lots of people who can. There are things you can do to avoid that, such as dying with nothing, which is always, as you would imagine, a fine timing issue. And other things as well that I don't have time to go into.
Thank you, Brian. Look, I do see a few hands up, but I'm unfortunately going to have to call it on that. We are running a little bit late.